Hello, friends. It's Jessica from Three Rivers Homestead, and I am here with week 2 of the 2024 Every Bit Counts Challenge. This is the food preservation challenge that we do every August here on YouTube and on Instagram. The goal of the challenge is just to preserve something every day in the month of August, no matter how small it is, because it's those little bits of work throughout the month that add up to a full stocked pantry by the end of the month. So in this video, I'll share with you all of the projects that I did this week here on my homestead. We're going to do some freezing. We're also going to do some fun canning projects. And some of the projects will be small and some of them will be a little more complicated. But I love sharing this work with you. It's one of my favorite series I do every year. So we're going to start slow. It was the weekend and we were really busy, so I just needed something quick at the end of the day that would take me about 15 minutes to do. And I saw these bananas. I don't know what it is about bananas, but some weeks I buy them and the kids don't eat them, and some weeks I can't buy enough. But we had two whole bunches of bananas that really needed to be preserved. And my muffin recipe that I make requires 3 bananas, and 3 bananas is a good amount for smoothies for our family for something like lunch. So I decided to vacuum seal them in packages of 3. This was a great way to use up these bananas, get them in the freezer, and we'll repurpose them a little later in the year. So just a really simple project for the first project of this week. Now on the next day, it was time to tackle these onions. Several videos ago, I showed you this onion harvest and how I was curing them down in our cellar. We just basically needed the greens on these onions to dry and they were ready to go. So this was the day that I decided to bring them up from the cellar. We just need to clean them up a little bit. And so I cut off all of those dried greens and those will go into the compost. And then I have a couple boxes of onions here that I need to sort through. I want to take the large and medium-sized onions and just package them into these bags of maybe 8 to 10 onions. And we're going to get those hanging down in the cellar, and that will be what we'll eat until they're gone for meals that we eat fresh. And then I have this box here of these are the smaller onions that really aren't worth storing in that way, but I will purpose these into canning projects. We can also dry them into onion powder or whatever else we want to do with these over the rest of the month in our food preservation projects. So I'm going to start on tomorrow's project. I grabbed some bones from the latest steer that we had processed, got them in my roaster and filled it up with water, and we're going to let that turn into broth overnight. And then the next day I had a roaster full of delicious gelatinous beef broth that we can turn into a French onion soup base. So we're going to can this in quart jars. I'm going to start by taking some of our homegrown garlic here, and I have 1 whole head of garlic, and I'm crushing those cloves, and then I'm going to divide them amongst these jars evenly. It worked out to be about 1.5 to 2 cloves per jar. Now I'm going to go through the other seasonings and flavorings that I like to put in my French onion soup base, and you can put whatever you want in yours. This is just what I'm doing on this day. I'm going to start with a bay leaf. We're just going to put 1 bay leaf per jar. The National Center for Food Preservation's guidelines for canning soups like this are pretty generous with how you flavor and season them. So really feel free to adapt this however you want your French onion soup to taste. I'm going to put 1 teaspoon of thyme per jar. That is a flavoring that I like to have in it. Now, normally I would add some W sauce. I'm not even going to try to pronounce it. What is it? Worcestershire sauce? I cannot pronounce it. My brain, it does not work. But I would add about a tablespoon of that per jar. I don't have any in the house right now, so we'll add that later on when I open up the jars. But I did put 1 teaspoon of salt per jar. And now it's time to add our onions. So like I said, I just want to use up these small onions that just aren't really worth putting into storage, but they're going to be great for canning projects. And I'm going to put my food processor to work for me to save me the trouble of chopping these and crying like a baby. Onions really seem to affect my very sensitive eyes, and it's almost like torture. And using the food processor really does seem to help me with that. Now, there still was a little bit of crying happening, but it wasn't nearly as bad as it would have been if I was chopping all of these by hand. So each food processor load filled a jar about, or 2 jars about halfway. And that was my goal for this canning project. So it's probably the equivalent of 2.5 to 3 larger sized onions that are going to go in each jar. But once again, there really aren't strict rules with canning soups as far as the National Center for Food Preservation goes on the ingredient list. So if you want to add more onion or less onion, it's really not going to make a difference in terms of the safety of what's going on in these jars. You're going to process them for the same amount of time, whether you add another onion or subtract an onion. So just make this however strong and pungent you would like it to be. Once I'm satisfied with all of the spices and seasonings and I have my jars adequately filled with the onions, it's going to be time to move on to filling the jars with our beef broth. Now, I did not season my beef broth with anything. This was just plain bones in water. The seasonings are in the jars with what I showed you, but you could add seasoned broth if you wanted to, and that wouldn't make a difference. We're just going to top these jars off with the hot broth. We want 1 inch of headspace before we get ready to can this. So I did stir it a little bit, and I'm adjusting to make sure that I maintain that 1 inch, and then that broth is pretty greasy, so we do want to make sure that we wipe the rims of those jars. Now I'm going to add my 4 jars canning lids. These are, of course, I always mention this, these are my favorite canning lids, and if you would like 10% off the best canning lids out there, use my code 3rivers10 with the link in this video description, and you can get a great deal on some canning lids for your own purposes. Now we're going to get our rings on, and we are going to process this in the pressure canner here for 75 minutes. I always get questions about the pressure, and you need to look at the guide for your specific canner and also at the elevation at which you live. That is, and what pressure you're going to can this at is going to be entirely dependent on things like that. So we will use these French onion soup bases to make different soups. One of my favorite ways to use these is to dump it over a roast in the crock pot. It just gives a delicious flavor to the roast. Very versatile food product that you can stock your pantry with and use in a million different ways. So I had lots of broth left over, obviously, because I'd filled that whole roaster. So I was able to fill up a couple of these half-gallon jars with the leftover broth. Then I went ahead and picked all the meat off of the bones, and as well as saved the marrow that was in the bones, and we were able to make a soup later on that week with everything else that I salvaged here from the roaster. All right, time to move on to the next day's project. I ran through the garden and grabbed a little harvest for that day's project, and look at this beautiful tomato that I found. This is a pink jazz from Baker Creek, and that tomato weighed in at 2 pounds 1 ounce. I was pretty proud of that and thought I would show you. But my purpose for going out into the garden was to grab some peppers. We are going to make a white chicken chili base, and we needed some green peppers and some hot peppers. So I chopped up the equivalent of 1 bell pepper, 1 green pepper here per jar. I also took my hot peppers, and once again I'm going to use the food processor to do the dirty work for me. So we just took the stems off of those, popped them in the food processor with some more of those tiny onions that we're trying to use up, and a whole head of garlic. And then after we chopped all of that up in the food processor, we can divide the hot pepper, the onion, and the garlic between the 7-quart jars that will make our batch of white chicken chili base here. Now, just like with the French onion soup base, you can pretty much adjust the seasonings on this soup base however you would like your white chicken chili to be flavored. I'll share with you what I'm deciding to do. I'm going to start with 1 teaspoon of oregano per jar. Then I'm going to add a half a teaspoon of turmeric. I'm going to do 2 teaspoons of cumin. Next, we're going to do just a half a teaspoon of chili powder because I don't want this to be too spicy for my kids, and I already have the hot pepper in there. And then we did 1 teaspoon of salt. As I mentioned, adjust it, make it as spicy as you want. That's not going to affect the safety of the canning recipe. Next thing we're going to do is add our chicken. I chopped up 1 chicken breast per jar. And then we're just going to fill it the rest of the way with some regular water straight from the tap. And when doing this, once again, we want 1-inch headspace from the top of the jar. That's standard for the soups that you're going to make. We're going to stir that around really well to release those air bubbles and then adjust that headspace to 1 inch. Then we're going to get our lids on the jars. We're going to put our rings on the jars. And just like with the French onion soup base, this is going to process in the pressure canner for 75 minutes for your quarts here. Now, when I want to use one of these jars, what I'll do is dump the contents into a pot. I will, for extra protein, we can add a quart or more of beans to the white chicken chili, add some extra broth. You could add any other vegetables you want, maybe add a pint of canned corn or whatever else you like in your white chicken chili. If you want more meat, you could add another quart of just plain canned chicken. This is just a soup base. That means it's a starter for the meal that contains most of the flavor, but it's just the start. You can jazz it up with whatever other ingredients that you want to complete the meal and to bulk it up to the size that you need for your family. Next day, I only had about 20 to 25 minutes to get a project accomplished, so I just ran to the garden and got about 4 cups of blackberries, washed them really well, and then we're going to add 1 cup of water to our pot here. I'm also going to add a half a cup of lemon juice. We're just going to make some quick blackberry jam. I need to bring the fruit up to a boil. So we're working on that, and then I'm going to use Sure Gel pectin because I have a bunch that needs to be used up. It's not my preferred pectin, but if I have it in storage, I'm going to use it before it goes bad. So stirring that pectin in and bringing the fruit back to a boil. Once it has boiled, I'm just going to mix that together with the immersion blender really quickly. Blackberries do have some seeds in it, and I think my kids prefer the texture when I blend it up really well. Some of those seeds kind of get blended up in there with it. Now that it's at a boil, I'm going to add 4 cups of sugar, and then we're going to stir that in, and we do need to bring that back to a boil again before we can fill the jars. Now, I know some of you are going to say that is way too much sugar, but remember that's 4 cups of sugar that's going to be spread over 7 half-pint jars. So each jar is going to contain less than a cup of sugar. And then when you're using this product, you're really only using 1 to 2 tablespoons per meal just to spread over your bread. So it seems like a lot of sugar when you're canning it, but per serving, when you're actually eating it in a meal, this isn't an item that you're going to just be eating a whole jar at a meal. Just a couple tablespoons really isn't going to leave you with that much sugar in the end. So I feel comfortable feeding this to my family. If you don't like sugar, use a Pomona's pectin or a different type of pectin that will allow you to use honey or less sugar in your recipe. We're going to fill our jars here. Like I said, I was able to get 6 full half pints. I had a little extra that was left over that we're going to use in a meal later on this week. But that was a good amount, I thought. 6 more jars to fill the pantry shelves makes me very happy. And with anything sticky like this, it's really important to make sure your rims are clean so that doesn't affect the seal of your lids. We're going to get these all ready to go into the water bath canner, and your jams and jellies are going to process for 10 minutes in the water bath. And I always add a little bit of distilled vinegar here, just maybe a half a cup or so to the water, and that prevents a mineral film. We have hard well water that will leave a film on the outside of the jar if I don't add that vinegar. So if you have the same problem, try adding about 1/4 a cup to a half a cup to the canner load and see if that makes a difference for you. So after we take it out of the canner, while it's still hot, it may not look like your jelly sets very much, so you do need to let it sit and cool for about 24 hours before you put it down in storage. We put some in the fridge, as I mentioned. I had not quite a full pint here, but it was enough for us to have for breakfast. So I just whipped up some biscuits and some scrambled eggs for the kids for the next day's breakfast and let them try out that Blackberry Jam with breakfast. And it was a hit as usual. The kids love it since we're a dairy-free family and we can't have butter on things like biscuits. We really do enjoy having a little bit of jam so we're not having to eat just plain bread and things like that. All right, it's the next morning, and Adam had picked me up 3 bushel bags of locally grown sweet corn on his way home from work the day before. Sweet corn is something that I don't grow myself, and that is because I downsized my garden pretty significantly a few years ago. Sweet corn is something that really does take up a lot of space, and if I calculate the amount of square footage it's going to take up in my garden, and compare that to the amount of food that I actually produce out of that space, this really isn't one of the most efficient foods to grow. And so between that and the fact that I do have a local source for it that's really high quality for a good price, I choose to let a local farmer grow this for me. And they have great canning deals where if I buy 2 bushel bags, I get the 3rd bag free, which makes this a really affordable project for us to do. So the kids helped me, and it only took us 15 minutes when we all worked together. It was right after breakfast, and we were able to shuck all of this corn together as well as get it all cleaned up. So not bad, 15 minutes to knock out all 3 of those bags of corn. It really does help to have everybody work together on things like this, because if I had been shucking this all by myself, it probably would have taken me a whole hour or so. I have lots of plans for this sweet corn. It's probably going to occupy my projects, my preservation projects for the next 2 or 3 days, but I would like to turn this corn into several different canned items as well as get some in the freezer. But this is really the first bulk project that I'm working on. Up to this point, it's just been kind of the little bits of harvest that have been coming in from our garden. So this is all of the corn we have, and then we have all of this left over that we need to do something with, all of the husks and the silks. And I know some of you are going to say I should turn the silks into tea, and if I had grown this corn myself, I would absolutely do that. But since I don't exactly know how the corn was grown, I prefer not to use these silks for tea. I do know that they do a light spray on this corn, so I prefer not to use that for tea and things. But the animals do love it. The chickens will eat all those silks and then compost down the husks for me. And even the cattle love the silks and the husks. So nothing went to waste here. Everything will get used. And like I said, about 15 minutes, all of the corn was ready for Mama to start processing, and the animals enjoyed a little treat. Now it was time for me to get to work. This is a really nifty tool. It's a corn decobber, one of my favorite preservation tools for dealing with corn. I'll link one in the video description for you, but this saves a lot of time and mess in getting that corn off the cob. And that's the first thing I'm going to do for today's project. We are going to make a chicken and corn chowder soup base. So I'm saving those cobs, and those will also go to the animals. You can also make corn cob jelly from them, and I will post a link in the video description for how to make corn cob jelly. We're not going to do that right now. I'm going to start by chopping up some onions. I'm going to add a whole head of garlic, as has been the case for most of our canning projects this week. The food processor is going to get that all chopped up for us. Once again, we're doing a 7-quart batch because 7 quarts is what fits in my standard pressure canner. So just splitting all of those onions and garlic amongst those 7 jars. Next, I'm adding a teaspoon of paprika to each jar, a teaspoon of thyme. I'm going to do a half a teaspoon of cayenne because I can't have it too spicy for the kids. We're going to do a half a teaspoon of turmeric and then 1 teaspoon of salt per jar. Next, I'm chopping up my chicken, just like with the other chicken canning projects I did, 1 chicken breast per jar. And I know that doesn't seem like a lot of chicken for a meal, but I'll explain how we can stretch that here in a minute. I washed all of the corn that I took off the cob really well. I'm draining that out. And then we're going to top these jars off with that decobbed sweet corn. Once the jars are full, we can add our water, and as with all of the other soups, we need to maintain our 1-inch headspace, and that corn and chicken is really packed in there tightly, so just make sure that you do debubble that and adjust your headspace, and then wipe those rims as usual. We are going to put our lids on, and once again, if you would like 10% off quality canning lids, check the link in the video description and use my code 3rivers10. Just like the other soup bases, these are going to go into the pressure canner for 75 minutes. And when they're done, we have a corn and chicken chowder base. When I want to use this, I'll dump the jar into a pot. I'll add a quart more of chicken if I want to up the amount of protein. I'll add more chicken broth. We'll make a roux and thicken it up into a chowder. I will also add a quart of canned potatoes, just a really simple meal. And like I said, I'm not expecting 1 chicken breast to be a huge portion of protein for the whole family, but I can bulk that up or I can serve protein in the 2 other meals that we eat that day. Not every meal has to have protein be the main star, the main ingredient of the meal. You can definitely have meatless meals or low protein meals and still have a balanced diet over the course of a 24-hour period. So that is it for this week. I'll be back next week with week 3 of preservation projects. I hope you're checking out the hashtag to see all of the other wonderful accounts that are participating. And we'll be back next week, friends. All right, bye.